Snow descended upon Ashcombe Hall in slow and solemn spirals, soft as funeral lace against the darkened countryside. Beyond the frosted windows, rows of black carriages crowded the circular drive while liveried footmen guided England's nobility beneath towering stone arches illuminated by torchlight. Inside, chandeliers shimmered like captive constellations above a sea of silk gowns, polished metals, and gloved hands carrying crystal glasses filled with amber champagne. A string quartet played near the marble staircase, their music delicate enough to sound almost sorrowful beneath the weight of gossip passing from mouth to mouth. No whisper moved more swiftly through the ballroom that evening than the name of Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. She should not have traveled in her condition. They say his lordship no longer shares her chambers. Poor creature. Marriage has diminished her entirely. Eleanor heard every word. She descended the staircase slowly, one pale hand resting against the carved banister while the other protected the gentle curve beneath her silver blue gown. Candlelight touched the softness of her golden hair, arranged with careful elegance despite the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. She carried herself with perfect posture, yet there was something heartbreakingly fragile about her grace, like porcelain enduring the first crack of winter ice. The guests bowed as etiquette required, though curiosity gleamed behind every smile. Eleanor answered each greeting with measured warmth, refusing to grant society the satisfaction of seeing humiliation upon her face. She had once entered ballrooms beside her husband as though they alone possessed some private understanding untouched by the world around them. Tonight she stood alone beneath hundreds of watching eyes, abandoned to speculation while Lord Cedric Ashcombe remained nowhere in sight. Near the orchestra, Lady Whitmore adjusted the emerald feathers in her hair and regarded Eleanor with thinly disguised pity. "My dear," she murmured sweetly, "you truly ought to rest. Motherhood demands sacrifices from a woman's beauty that even youth cannot survive." A few ladies nearby concealed their amusement behind jeweled fans. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her gloves, though her expression never faltered. "Then I shall consider beauty a small price for something infinitely greater." The reply silenced them briefly, yet the victory felt hollow. She moved through the ballroom with quiet dignity while conversations fractured around her like breaking glass. Everywhere she turned, she sensed the same question lingering unspoken beneath polite smiles. Why had Lord Ashcombe ceased loving his wife? Cedric had once been admired throughout London for his cold brilliance and impossible composure. Tall, dark-haired, and severe in manner, he possessed the kind of presence that commanded silence without effort. Men respected him. Women watched him too carefully. Yet during recent months he had withdrawn from society almost entirely, leaving Eleanor to endure endless rumors alone. As the evening deepened, snow battered harder against the windows while heat from the crowded ballroom thickened the air. Eleanor struggled to breathe beneath the weight of her corset and the child pressing painfully against her ribs. She excused herself from a cluster of guests and stepped toward the long gallery overlooking the gardens. The corridor beyond the ballroom lay dim and mercifully quiet. Portraits of dead Ashcombe stared from gilded frames while distant laughter echoed faintly through the manor. Eleanor rested briefly beside a tall window, steadying herself as dizziness passed through her. Then she heard Cedric's voice. Oh, familiar. Unmistakable. Her pulse stumbled. The sound drifted from the study at the end of the corridor, where a line of warm light glowed beneath the door. Eleanor moved toward it slowly, almost against her own will. For weeks she had scarcely exchanged more than formal sentences with her husband. Every attempt at tenderness had met a wall of restraint she no longer understood. Another man spoke inside the room. "The matter cannot remain hidden forever. Once the debts become public, your wife will suffer for it." A long silence followed. Eleanor's heart tightened painfully. Then Cedric answered with exhausted bitterness. "I am aware of my responsibilities." "You are also aware," the other man replied carefully, "that London already pities her." The words settled like poison in the quiet corridor. For one suspended moment, Eleanor almost entered the room. She imagined confronting him directly, demanding honesty instead of this endless distance swallowing their marriage piece by piece. Her trembling hand even lifted toward the brass handle. Then Cedric spoke again. "I should never have married." Everything inside her seemed to stop. The musicians downstairs continued their waltz. Laughter still drifted through distant halls. Somewhere beyond the windows, snow buried the sleeping gardens beneath white silence. Yet Eleanor heard only those 5 words repeating through her mind with unbearable clarity. "I should never have married." A sharp breath escaped her lips before she could contain it. Inside the study, movement followed instantly. Eleanor stepped backward in panic and turned away before the door could open. Her vision blurred as she hurried down the corridor, one hand clutching her stomach while the other dragged against the wall for balance. She descended the rear staircase blindly, escaped through the conservatory doors, and stumbled into the freezing night air without cloak or escort. Snow lashed against her face as she crossed the darkened garden. The fountain ahead shimmered beneath ice, ghostly beneath the storm. Behind her, the manor blazed with golden light, magnificent and cruel all at once. She tried to rise, but weakness spread through her limbs like cold water seeping into silk. Above the storm, the distant ballroom music sounded distorted now, as though coming from another lifetime entirely. Eleanor pressed a shaking hand against her mouth to silence the sob threatening to escape. More than anger, more than humiliation, she felt grief for the man Cedric had once been with her. Gentle in private, protective, capable of looking at her as though the world itself had softened. Then pain twisted sharply through her body. Eleanor collapsed beside the frozen fountain, breathless against the snow, while somewhere behind her footsteps began running through the darkness toward her. Morning crept over Ashcombe Hall beneath a sky the color of old silver. Snow clung to the iron gates and rosebushes while servants moved quietly through the manor with lowered voices, as though grief still slept inside the walls. The previous night's music had vanished. In its place remained silence, broken occasionally by fireplaces and the muted tolling of church bells drifting across the frozen countryside. Eleanor awakened beneath heavy blankets, her body aching from cold and exhaustion. Pale winter light filtered through velvet curtains, illuminating the faint bruise shadowing her temple where she had struck the fountain stone during her collapse. For several moments she could not remember how she had returned to her chamber. Then Cedric's voice echoed once more through her memory. "I should never have married." The pain returned instantly. A physician stood near the hearth packing away his instruments while Eleanor's maid, Mrs. Aldridge, adjusted the tea tray beside the bed. Concern deepened every line upon the older woman's face. "You must remain calm, my lady," the physician warned gently. "Any further distress may endanger both yourself and the child." Eleanor lowered her gaze toward her trembling hands. "I assure you, sir, calmness appears to be my only remaining talent." The physician hesitated, sensing sorrow deeper than illness, yet propriety prevented further questions. After offering instructions regarding rest, he departed quietly, leaving Eleanor alone with the hiss of the fire. Only then did she notice the flowers. A cluster of white roses rested beside her bedside table in a crystal vase, their petals luminous against the dim chamber. Beneath them lay a folded card written in masculine handwriting she did not recognize. "Some hearts speak cruelly only because they are afraid." Eleanor read the sentence twice. No signature accompanied it. A strange ache moved through her chest. Cedric had not sent flowers to her in months, yet something about the restrained tenderness of the message unsettled her more deeply than open affection might have done. She touched one rose carefully while snow continued falling beyond the windows. By afternoon the rumors had already spread beyond Ashcombe Hall. London society possessed a monstrous appetite for elegant suffering, and Lady Eleanor's collapse during the winter ball provided irresistible entertainment. Newspapers avoided direct accusations, yet cruel implications hid within every polished line. One article remarked upon Lord Ashcombe's conspicuous emotional reserve toward his pregnant wife. Another questioned whether financial difficulties had poisoned the marriage. Invitations quietly ceased arriving. Friends who had once sought Eleanor's company suddenly discovered pressing obligations elsewhere. Humiliation moved through aristocratic circles faster than truth ever could. Eleanor attempted to occupy herself with embroidery beside the drawing-room fire, though her thoughts drifted constantly toward the unsigned note. Near dusk, a footman entered carrying a small parcel wrapped in dark paper. "No sender was given, my lady." Inside rested a silver music box Eleanor had not seen since childhood. Tiny painted violets decorated its lid. Her breath caught sharply as she opened it. A soft melody drifted into the room beneath the rain striking the windows. She remembered instantly. Years earlier, before marriage and titles complicated everything between them, Cedric had repaired the broken mechanism himself after finding her crying over it beside her father's garden. He had spent an evening fixing the tiny gears while pretending indifference to her gratitude. "You looked heartbroken," he had murmured afterward without meeting her eyes. "The sound annoyed me less than your tears." At the memory, Eleanor closed the music box and pressed trembling fingers against her lips. Fear did not explain such tenderness. That evening Cedric remained absent from dinner once again. Yet elsewhere within the manor, hidden beyond the warmth of family chambers, he sat alone inside his study surrounded by ledgers, legal documents and half-burned candles. Shadows hollowed his face while untouched whiskey rested near his hand. The estate accounts spread across the desk resembled battlefield casualties more than financial records. Ashcombe was collapsing. Debts accumulated across generations now threatened to devour everything bearing the family name. Several investors had already begun circling the estate like vultures awaiting death. Cedric understood what London would do once the truth emerged. His title would survive. His pride might survive. Eleanor would not. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the sound of her breathing as he carried her unconscious body from the snow the previous night. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. His valet stepped carefully inside. Your lordship, the carriage is prepared for tomorrow's charity luncheon. Cedric's expression hardened immediately. Cancel it. I fear your absence would worsen the speculation, sir. For several moments Cedric said nothing. Rain battered the study windows while firelight trembled across the room. Finally he rose, exhausted, restraint settling across his features like armor. Very well. The luncheon took place the following afternoon inside a glittering London hotel overflowing with perfume, diamonds, and false civility. Eleanor entered wearing deep blue velvet that emphasized the softness of her condition while concealing how pale she had become. Lady Whitmore approached almost instantly, smiling with venomous elegance. My dear Lady Ashcombe, she sighed, how courageous of you to appear publicly while your husband entertains such fascinating company elsewhere. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. I do not believe I understand your meaning. Surely you must. London speaks of little else. Lady Whitmore lowered her voice theatrically. A gentleman seldom abandons his wife unless another woman offers stronger consolation. The cruelty landed precisely where intended. Eleanor felt heat rise behind her eyes, yet before she could answer, a familiar voice cut through the gathering silence. No one in this room possesses the dignity of my wife. Cedric stood at the ballroom entrance, rain glistening across the shoulders of his black coat. The room fell motionless around him. Without sparing another glance for the guests, he crossed toward Eleanor and extended his arm. My lady. Her pulse faltered. As her gloved fingers touched his sleeve, Eleanor noticed something dark staining the leather near his wrist. Fresh blood. Rain hammered against the windows of Ashcombe Hall, turning the manor into an island of candlelight. The storm had deepened throughout the evening, swallowing the gardens beneath sheets of rain while wind prowled along the corridors like a restless spirit. Inside the library, firelight flickered across shelves of books and polished mahogany, casting shadows whenever thunder shook the walls. Eleanor stood near the hearth wrapped in a wool shawl, her fingers curled tightly against the fabric as though it alone kept her standing. Since the luncheon 2 days earlier, Cedric had resumed avoiding her. Yet the image of blood staining his glove haunted her thoughts with unease. Whatever distance existed between them no longer resembled simple indifference. It felt dangerously close to despair. The library door opened behind her. Cedric entered still wearing his riding coat, rainwater glistening upon the wool. His dark hair clung against his forehead, softening the severe sharpness of his features. For one suspended moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them while thunder rolled across the countryside. You should not be awake at this hour, he said at last. Eleanor lifted her chin despite the ache tightening her chest. And you should not bleed through your gloves while pretending nothing is wrong. A shadow crossed his expression before vanishing beneath restraint. He removed the gloves slowly and placed them upon a nearby table. Fresh cuts marked his knuckles, reddened despite hurried bandaging. What happened? She asked quietly. Nothing requiring concern. That answer no longer satisfies me. Her voice trembled despite her effort to remain composed. Cedric noticed it immediately. His gaze lowered briefly toward the curve beneath her gown, and something tender flickered across his face before he buried it again. You ought to rest, Eleanor. No. The word startled both of them. 4 months she had obeyed every silence, every cold dismissal, every wall between them. Tonight exhaustion overcame dignity. You do not vanish for days, send anonymous gifts, defend me before half of London, and then expect me to continue pretending none of it matters. Her breathing grew uneven. I heard what you said outside the study. I heard every word. Cedric went completely still. Rain battered the windows. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes bright with restrained hurt. Tell me the truth. Did you truly mean it? For several moments he said nothing. The firelight carved exhaustion into his face, revealing sleepless nights and burdens too heavy for pride alone. At last he walked toward the decanter near the desk, though he did not drink. The estate is failing, he said quietly. The confession settled heavily between them. Cedric stared into the fire rather than at her. My father concealed the severity of the debts before his death. Investments collapsed. Creditors are circling Ashcombe already. His jaw tightened. Within weeks, perhaps days, the scandal will become public. Eleanor struggled to absorb the words. Why hide this from me? Because I know what society does to ruined women. His voice darkened with bitterness. Titles protect men. They do not protect wives carrying children through public disgrace. At last he looked at her directly, and the grief inside his eyes struck harder than anger ever could. I thought distance might spare you when everything collapsed. Eleanor's breath caught. You wish to protect me, she whispered. I wish to make you hate me. The honesty of it shattered something fragile inside her. Cedric crossed the room slowly, every movement burdened by restraint. If you despised me, leaving would become easier. You might return to your family before the ruin touched you. His expression hardened with self-contempt. Instead, I succeeded only in hurting you. Eleanor fought against tears threatening her composure. You allowed me to believe I had become unlovable. A flicker of anguish crossed his face. You were never unlovable. The words emerged rough with emotion, as though dragged from somewhere buried. Cedric closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. Every unkind word I spoke was a coward's attempt to prepare you for losing me. Silence followed. Outside, rain cascaded against the windows while the fire softened the edges of the room. Eleanor stared at the man before her and realized that his cruelty had never come from absence of feeling. It had come from terror so profound he believed love itself endangered her. The realization hurt far more deeply than rejection. Slowly, Cedric lowered himself beside her chair. The movement carried none of his usual aristocratic control. It felt almost like surrender. His hand hesitated briefly before resting against her stomach through the silk fabric of her gown. The child moved instantly. Cedric froze. A faint kick pressed beneath his palm, startling and unmistakable. For the first time in months, genuine wonder softened his expression completely. The cold reserve vanished until he looked younger, vulnerable in ways Eleanor had never witnessed before. His throat tightened. I had forgotten, he murmured hoarsely, how small miracles feel. Tears slipped silently down Eleanor's cheeks. Cedric looked upward at her then, his hand still trembling against their unborn child, and something intimate passed between them stronger than apology. It was grief, longing, tenderness, and love stripped bare beneath the storm. A sudden knock shattered the moment. Both turned sharply as the butler entered carrying several sealed documents. Unease shadowed the older man's face. Forgive the intrusion, my lord, he said carefully, but Mr. Blackwood has arrived from London. Cedric rose immediately, tension returning to his posture. At this hour? He insisted the matter could not wait. The butler extended the papers with reluctance. Cedric scanned the top page once and all remaining color drained from his face. Eleanor stood slowly. What is it? For several terrible seconds he could not answer. Then he folded the documents carefully and said, with frightening calmness, Foreclosure proceedings begin tomorrow morning. Thunder shook the manor. Eleanor watched Cedric turn toward the windows, his shoulders rigid beneath the firelight, and suddenly understood the true depth of the storm gathering around them tonight. Morning arrived at Ashcombe Hall beneath a sky heavy with thawing snow, yet no warmth touched the manor. Servants moved through the corridors carrying account ledgers, sealed letters, and silver trays no one touched. Rumor had transformed into certainty overnight. By noon, London's newspapers openly questioned whether the Ashcombe estate would survive the season. Eleanor refused to surrender to it. While Cedric remained locked inside meetings with solicitors and creditors, she sat before her dressing mirror removing the last pieces of jewelry inherited from her mother. Diamonds glimmered coldly against the velvet lining of the case. Once, those jewels had symbolized status and celebration. Mrs. Aldridge watched anxiously from nearby. My lady, you must not exhaust yourself. Eleanor closed the lid firmly. If the house is burning, standing still becomes another form of cowardice. Within hours she had arranged private sales through discreet acquaintances unwilling to publicly associate themselves with scandal. Carriages carried away necklaces, bracelets, and antique brooches while Eleanor endured every transaction. Each sacrifice wounded her less than the memory of Cedric believing she required protection from truth. By evening, word of her actions reached him. Cedric entered the drawing room with restrained fury darkening his features. You sold your mother's jewels. Eleanor continued signing correspondence at the writing desk. I sold stones and gold. The sentiment remains untouched. You had no right to involve yourself in this. At that she finally looked up. Candlelight sharpened the exhaustion beneath his eyes and the anger beneath hers. No right, she repeated softly. I carry your child while society tears apart our marriage for entertainment, yet you still speak as though I exist outside this disaster. Cedric opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Eleanor rose carefully from the chair. Pregnancy had softened neither her dignity nor her resolve. You wished to bear ruin alone because pride taught you suffering was nobler than honesty. Her voice trembled slightly. But marriage is not a performance conducted before strangers. If we fall, Cedric, we fall together. The word struck him harder than accusation. For a long moment silence filled the room except for rain tapping against the windows. Then Cedric crossed toward her and took the correspondence from her hands, setting it aside with unexpected tenderness. You should not have been forced into strength by my failures, he murmured. Eleanor searched his face. And you should not mistake love for weakness. Something shifted between them then, subtle yet profound. Beneath the sharpness of his restraint lived a man terrified of losing everything he loved, including the woman standing before him now. The following night they attended a political dinner at Blackthorn Manor, where England's wealthiest families gathered beneath glittering chandeliers and painted ceilings. Cedric had intended to decline the invitation, but absence would only confirm the scandal consuming their name. Together they entered the ballroom while conversations faltered around them. Eleanor felt every stare. Women studied her growing stomach with curiosity sharpened by gossip. Gentlemen whispered behind crystal glasses while musicians continued their waltz with mechanical cheerfulness. Yet Cedric remained beside her throughout the evening, his gloved hand steady against her back whenever crowds pressed too near. Near midnight, Lord Blackthorn finally delivered the humiliation everyone anticipated. Rising from the dinner table with theatrical politeness, he lifted his wineglass toward Cedric. To perseverance, he announced smoothly, particularly in difficult financial seasons. Laughter scattered uneasily through the room. Blackthorn smiled wider. Though I confess admiration for Lady Ashcombe above all. Such grace beneath unfortunate circumstances is exceedingly rare. The insult hid beneath civility, precisely where aristocrats preferred their cruelty. Cedric's expression hardened instantly, but before he could speak, Eleanor stood. Silence spread outward from her chair. She rested one hand lightly against the table while candlelight shimmered across the deep emerald silk of her gown. Though visibly weary, she possessed a calm that commanded attention more effectively than outrage ever could. My lord, she said gently, addressing Blackthorn directly, fortune is fragile. Tonight it favors some among us. Tomorrow it may abandon others just as easily. No one moved. Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the weight of every watching eye, but dignity is revealed most truthfully when comfort disappears. A marriage cannot be measured by gossip, nor loyalty by wealth. If courtship visits a household, love either leaves quietly through the front door or remains beside the fire until morning. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Cedric. I consider myself fortunate that mine has remained. The ballroom fell utterly still. Cedric stared at her as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Then, before England's most powerful families, he rose slowly and reached for her hand. Every whisper vanished. His voice carried through the silence with quiet authority. Every honorable thing remaining in me belongs to my wife. Emotion tightened Eleanor's throat. Blackthorn lowered his gaze first. For the remainder of the evening Cedric scarcely released her hand. Snow had begun falling again when they departed the manor after midnight. Their carriage rolled slowly through white-covered streets while lantern light flickered across the windows. Cedric removed his gloves and looked at her with unguarded vulnerability. I spent months convincing myself distance would spare you suffering, he said quietly, but every moment away from you became its own punishment. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. He lifted her hand to his lips. I love you with enough fear to ruin me. Tears filled her eyes before she could prevent them. The carriage stopped before Ashcombe Hall beneath swirling snow. Cedric helped her down, his arm firm around her waist as they crossed the frozen courtyard together. Eleanor allowed herself to believe their future might still survive. Then a violent pain seized her body. She gasped sharply and stumbled against him, fingers tightening desperately around his coat. Cedric caught her instantly. Eleanor. Another pain followed, deeper and far more terrifying. Snow spun around them while color drained from Cedric's face. And beneath the sky, Eleanor realized the child was coming far too soon through the bitter wind. Snow swirled violently across the courtyard as Cedric carried Eleanor through the doors of Ashcombe Hall. Her breathing came in broken gasps against his shoulder while servants rushed forward in alarm. Somewhere beyond the grand staircase, thunder rattled the windows hard enough to shake the candle flames. "Send for the physician immediately," Cedric ordered, "and wake every maid in the house." No one had ever heard fear in Lord Ashcombe's voice before. Eleanor clutched the front of his coat as another wave of pain tore through her body. The agony stole her breath and left her trembling against him. Cedric tightened his hold instinctively, shielding her from the chaos surrounding them while servants hurried across the marble floors. "It is too early," she whispered weakly. "You will be safe," he answered, though terror hollowed the certainty from his tone. He carried her upstairs himself, refusing assistance despite exhaustion pulling at every movement. Inside their chamber, firelight cast restless shadows against the walls while maids prepared hot water and fresh linens with frantic urgency. Snow hammered the windows as though the storm itself meant to force its way inside. The physician arrived near midnight, his expression grave after only moments beside Eleanor's bed. "The child may come tonight," he warned quietly. "Her ladyship must conserve her strength." Cedric stood rigid beside the fireplace. "And my wife?" The physician hesitated too long. A silence colder than winter settled across the room. At last the older man lowered his gaze. "We shall do everything possible." The word struck Cedric like a sentence already passed. Hours crawled by beneath candlelight and storm winds. Eleanor drifted between exhaustion and pain while the house remained awake around her. Servants whispered prayers in corridors. Clock hands advanced with unbearable slowness. Cedric never left her side. He knelt beside the bed holding her hand through every contraction, his composure unraveling piece by piece whenever she cried out softly in pain. The proud distance that once defined him had vanished entirely. Nothing remained except the husband watching the woman he loved suffer because of a world he had failed to protect her from. Near dawn, Eleanor's strength began fading. The physician exchanged troubled glances with the midwife while Cedric noticed every silent signal between them. Fear closed around his chest with merciless force. "Speak plainly," he demanded. The physician removed his spectacles slowly. "If labor continues this way, we may lose them both." For one suspended moment Cedric could not breathe. The room blurred around him. He remembered Eleanor standing alone beneath chandeliers while society whispered against her. He remembered the frozen fountain where he had found her collapsed in the snow. Most painfully of all, he remembered the cruelty of his own voice outside the study door. "I should never have married." The memory sickened him now. He crossed toward the bed as though approaching something sacred. Eleanor looked impossibly fragile against the white linens, her golden hair damp against her temples. Yet when she saw his face, she still attempted a faint smile. "You must not look so frightened," she whispered. Cedric sank into the chair beside her and pressed her trembling hand against his lips. For the first time in his life, pride abandoned him completely. "I have been frightened since the day I realized losing you would destroy me." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. He bowed his head beside her hand. "I thought love required sacrifice. Instead, I turned it into punishment." His voice broke quietly. "God forgive me for every moment I made you feel alone." Eleanor touched his cheek weakly. "You came back to me." "No," he said hoarsely. "You endured long enough for me to find my way back." Another contraction seized her before she could answer. Pain twisted across her features while the midwife hurried forward again. Cedric stepped back helplessly as the women surrounded the bed. Minutes became unbearable eternities. Then suddenly the physician looked upward sharply. "My lord, you must wait outside." Cedric refused instantly. "No. The situation may worsen quickly." "I said no." The force in his voice silenced the room. He remained beside Eleanor through every terrible moment that followed, holding her hand while dawn slowly approached beyond the storm clouds. Time lost meaning entirely. There existed only candlelight, whispered instructions, Eleanor's uneven breathing, and Cedric's desperate prayers to a God he had ignored most of his life. Then, just as the first pale light touched the windows, silence fell. A horrifying silence. The midwife's face tightened. The physician reached forward urgently. Cedric felt the world stop. "Eleanor?" Her eyes fluttered weakly toward him, yet she could no longer answer. Panic surged through him with brutal clarity. He gathered her hand between both of his as though warmth alone might anchor her to him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice trembling openly now. "You are not permitted to leave me. Do you understand?" Tears burned down his face unchecked. "I spent too long wasting what was precious. I cannot bury you after finally learning how to love you properly." For one terrible heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Eleanor's fingers moved faintly against his. At the same instant, a newborn cry shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the chamber like the first breath of spring after endless winter. Cedric stared in stunned disbelief as the midwife lifted a crying infant wrapped in white cloth. Relief crashed through the room so suddenly several servants began weeping openly near the doorway. "A daughter," the midwife whispered. Cedric could barely stand. The physician turned back toward Eleanor after examining her carefully. "Her ladyship will recover." Those 4 words nearly undid him. Cedric lowered himself beside the bed once more, overcome by emotion too immense for restraint. Eleanor looked exhausted beyond measure, yet alive. Truly alive. When the midwife placed their daughter carefully into her arms, soft wonder transformed her entire face. Cedric touched the infant's tiny hand with reverence. "She has your eyes," Eleanor murmured weakly. "No," he replied softly. "She has your courage." Morning sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds, spilling gold across the chamber and melting the last traces of darkness from the walls. Beyond the windows, snow still covered Ashcombe Hall, yet the world no longer felt frozen. Weeks later, the first roses of early spring bloomed beside the garden fountain where Eleanor had once collapsed alone beneath the storm. Financial troubles remained unresolved, and society still whispered behind polished smiles, but none of it possessed the same power anymore. One quiet afternoon, Eleanor stood upon the manor steps holding their daughter beneath a pale blue sky while Cedric approached from the gardens. He paused before her with an expression she once believed impossible for him. Peace. Then he bent carefully and kissed her forehead. "If I possess any remaining honor in this life," he said, "it belongs entirely to you." Eleanor smiled softly through the breeze stirring her hair. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "we have both survived enough sorrow for one lifetime." Cedric gathered his wife and child into his arms while sunlight warmed the stone beneath them. And in a world where pride had nearly destroyed love, tenderness finally proved itself the greater strength.